Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson analyzes wheat markets, Marion Kelmer discusses how on-farm research helped him determine optimum soybean seeding rates and row spacing, Bruce Anderson explains why cattle producers need to be aware of nitrate dangers when feeding cattle during winter months, and Tamra Jackson-Ziems joins us to look at possible problems when storing grain for long periods of time. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our marketing analyst this week. Frayne joined us Monday to analyze U.S. wheat markets, international production, and the latest USDA crop reports.
Well, in general, most of the reports came out with subtle changes. It was in general positive for corn. We had a slight increase in harvested acreage, but a decrease in yields, as well as the quarterly stocks report showed that we had a little tighter supplies than we had expected. For soybeans, relatively neutral. Small changes in the balance sheet. The quarterly grain stocks report was about where we had expected. And in general, a negative tone for wheat. We had a slight increase in the ending stocks for wheat. We had a slight increase in the world ending stocks for wheat. But then there was a few surprises in the winter wheat plantings report as well.
The winter wheat that's in the ground right now, Frayne, and as you mentioned, the winter wheat seedings number came out. It's just less than 42 million acres, but that winter wheat that's in the ground, you know, going into January, there were some really, really rough temperatures and rough weather. Do you have a sense of maybe if that impacted that winter wheat at all?
Well, it's a little bit early to tell right now, and the big debate is we have a pretty significant portion of the winter wheat belt that has snow cover, and of course the snow cover helps provide some insulation for the growing point, and hopefully the areas that do have good snow cover won't have major winter kill issues. But there are also parts of the winter wheat belt that have no snow, and of course those lower temperatures really can have an impact on the growth point and potential freeze damage as we move forward. The challenge we have is we really won't know what the implications are until later on this spring, once the winter wheat starts to break dormancy and we start moving forward and start to take some stand counts.
Would those be both hard red and soft red, Frayne?
That would be both for hard red and soft red as well, yes.
Okay, so as I mentioned, the seeding numbers came out for winter wheat, less than 42 million acres. Overall impressions?
Yeah, that was a little bit of a surprise. I know there were some private analysts, and I know myself included, was expecting a slight increase in the winter wheat seedings report. Again, primarily because of the price relationships that we saw between winter wheat and soybeans and corn during the time that you have to make a decision on winter wheat seedings. I guess the surprise was we had a pretty significant cutback in soft red winter wheat plantings, about almost 1.6 million acres. Now, all winter wheat was down about 1.2 million acres, so we had a slight increase in the winter wheat. We had a slight increase in the white wheat area, but the big cutback was in soft red winter. And if you look at where soft red winter wheat is typically grown, that's kind of in the heart of the corn-soybean belt. And so that really raises some questions as we move forward, not only longer term for the price outlook for wheat, because we do have lower acreage, but then what happens to the planting intentions as we move forward for corn and soybeans as well. What are those 1.2 million acres going to be planted to? And given the price relationships we see right now, we do need to see a cutback in the corn acreage, or we're going to see some significantly lower corn prices. We can see some increase in the soybean plantings, but again, you know, there's limits to how far the price can drop before that takes the bite out of the bottom line for farmers as well. So this will really start, as we moving forward, start some interesting discussions about what might come this spring.
Is it just this spring, Frayne, or is that a long-term impact as well?
Well, there is a combination of both. Again, for the wheat market specifically, it'll have a little bit longer term implications, because obviously if we have lower seedings, that means that it puts more pressure on yield and yield potential and coming back into your potential frost damage. Right now, most of the growing region for the winter wheat belt has good soil moisture, but again, that can change fairly rapidly if we start getting into some warm, dry spring. On the corn and bean side, you know, that's really a seasonal adjustment. We will have to also wait to see what happens out of South America for both the corn and soybean yields. That will have an impact then on how many acres we need to produce here in the United States and what kind of prices we might see next fall.
For the price of wheat, there has been little to no momentum. What do you foresee for the rest of January?
Well, that's a bit of a trick. There's a significant downtrend remaining in the wheat markets. There is some resistance levels that start to show up in that $6 per bushel range on the futures price. From a technical standpoint, I think a lot of the traders are kind of looking at that as a potential floor or base that we're putting in. I think some of the technical analysts are also looking at the lows we put in just previous to the report on the corn side. And of course, we always have that linkage between corn and soybean prices, or corn and wheat prices, excuse me. So as we move forward, I do think we'll start to see some leveling off and the potential for increases as we move into spring.
Next week, Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Towards the end of 2013, we showed you interviews from the Nebraska Soybean Day and Machinery Expo in Wahoo. The event is sponsored in part by the Nebraska Soybean Board and presents updated research and checkoff information, and also provides growers with current market and weather conditions. One presenter there was Illinois farmer Marion Kelmer. Marion grows corn and soybeans in western Illinois and is also the owner of Kelmer Cornheads. Through his on-farm research, he's found growing soybeans in 15-inch rows at 75,000 plants per acre is his most profitable option. At the event, Marion shared 5 tips for growing profitable soybeans, including using no-till, dry fertilizer, narrow row spacing, seeding rates, and residue management. We talked with Marion to see how these things have played a role in increasing profitability on his acres.
I've got about 500 that I do all of the research on in western Illinois. It's IPAVA, Tama soils, poorly drained, but very, very, very productive.
Why have you put such an emphasis on trying to do research on your farm?
Well, in the mid-'80s, I bought my first farm, and I said, you know, if I'm going to pay for this ground, I better farm as profitable as I can. So I started doing a little bit of on-farm research, and of course now we run one of the largest independent ag research centers. So I don't allow anybody to give me any money to do research, because you've got the chance to alter your opinion. I figure at my farming operation, the things that I have learned over the past 20, 30 years are giving me an annual return of about $50,000 a year. I only spend a couple of days in the spring. I maybe slow down. Instead of being done in 7 days, it maybe takes me 9 days to plant. But for a couple days in the spring and a couple days at harvest time, I'm making $50,000. That's pretty good money. And at the same time, I think doing a little something for the environment.
Is it something that you think every farmer could do?
Oh, absolutely. I tell everybody that we can't improve on things we don't measure. And we're farmers. We're always going to be farmers. But gosh, you wake up in the morning and it's just like you got to put your business hat on, and you got to be able to run the calculator, and you've got to have information to feed the calculator with. And like I'm telling these guys right here, if you got 1,000 acres of beans, 2 pieces of information that we provided today is worth about, over a 10-year run, is worth over $750,000.
One of the things that you found benefit in is no-till. Why do you think it's worked so well for you?
Well, I think, it's Mother Nature's natural cover to the earth is the residue. And if we take that away, we become vulnerable to water and wind erosion. And it's just, there's no upside to it. The soil only reproduces itself at the rate of about 1 sheet of paper per year. And that means I'm buying several of the farms that I own. I don't want to see it wash down there. And I've got a daughter coming along, and she doesn't want to see it wash away. So I think we've got a responsibility to the environment. Number two, though, it's also got to be profitable. In the early years, yeah, it was kind of give or take. I was learning, it was kind of awkward, but then boy, once we got about 5 years downrange on no-till, and things started kicking in, and now it's just an annual return of seeing how moist that soil is. We've had 2 nasty droughts in western Illinois. I mean, the end of June, it just stops raining and it gets hot. And we've had wonderful crops. I guarantee you, if I was under a full tillage system, I wouldn't have had near the crop that I did in a no-till environment.
If I remember right, your soybean population is around 75,000. Tell me how you got set up in that, because there's a lot of numbers involved.
Oh yeah, I went to college, and I used to plant them at 200,000 when I was a kid, and so I started doing the research on it. And I said, you know what, that's fine. You can tell me anything you want, and you can pick up any bit of information and read it. At the end of the day, if you want me to spend another 25 bucks an acre, I got to have $30 worth of grain to pay for the cost of the seed. And my farm, it's just not there. We've got over 5 years worth of data, long, narrow, replicated plots out there. So we've got probably 40 to 50 replications side by side. 75,000 on the screen at planting time is my most profitable soybean population, which is contrary to what you're going to read or any seed person's going to say. Nothing personal with the seed industry. It's just bottom line, 75,000 the most profitable at my farm.
Your row spacing is mostly in 15-inch rows, is that correct?
Yep.
What are the pros and cons to that? I mean, I know a lot of people have done research on this, and the one thing that I know has been a con in some areas is that they find more disease pressure between the row when the plants are close together.
You're exactly right. As we bring that canopy in tighter and tighter, it's going to take longer to burn the fog out in the fall, and the moisture is going to be there, which sets us up for white mold. On the flip side of that is when we put population and row spacing together, and if I'm planting narrow-rowed beans at 75,000, then I've got a more open canopy that allows the air to go through there. So when I'm in the low hundreds to 75,000, I don't see the white mold, and so I'm okay in those narrow row spacings. Drilled beans work really well. At the end of the day, soybeans are a legume. Alfalfa is a legume. It doesn't make any sense to put legumes in rows. It's abnormal, and I don't think alfalfa likes it. I don't think the soybeans like it. Solid seeded is the concept.
Looking at anything interesting for 2014 or anything different this year?
On the soybean side of things, we're still pretty much status quo here. We're playing around a little bit with some combine stuff on that. On the flip side, on producing corn, one of the new and exciting areas is that we're starting to breed corn plants, and they're changing very rapidly. They're going to be shorter in height. There's going to be a smaller tassel. They're still going to have the same number of leaves, and they're going to have smaller ears. There's just going to be a lot more of them in the field. Corn is a grass, solid seeded, smaller ears, and a lot more of them, because we have got to get to 300 bushel, and we need, as farmers, our responsibility is to start to learn how to do it today so that we can pass it on to future generations. In 30 years, each and every one of us will be responsible for 300 bushel the acre in order to feed the demand that corn will have 30 years from now.
As farmers begin to think about soybean inputs for the 2014 growing season, next week, UNL Extension plant pathologist Lauren Giesler will join us to look at the use of foliar fungicides. In our previous episode, UNL Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson explained what to look for when reading a forage analysis. This week, Bruce joins us again to discuss why you need to be aware of nitrate dangers in forages before feeding them to livestock. We've talked about those dangers in drought-stressed corn both this year and last year, but Bruce says during this time period, it's also crucial to know what's in your stored forages.
Well, this is really the time, Jeff, when we're typically going to be feeding most of those hays that may have risky levels of nitrates in them. We're taking that oat hay, or we're taking that CRP hay, or we're taking some that cane hay or millet hay that we grew in this past summertime, and now we're into the winter where we need to start feeding that hay to the animals, and we need to make sure that we've kept track of what we've been harvesting. Hopefully we've done some testing of the most risky hays that we have out there and know what the nitrate levels are in them, and then can keep track of that as we're feeding it to the animals.
One of your concerns is if there would be a snowstorm and things get covered up, that's what you're going to feed right away.
That's right. Oftentimes our biggest risk period is when the animals have not been eating for a while, and that's typically after a snowstorm. They may go a day or two with very little to eat, and then in our rush to get some hay out to them, once we get that opportunity to do so, we may kind of thoughtlessly or in our rush grab on onto any bale or stack that we have handy and take that out to the animals. We need to be really careful at that time that the hay that we present to them when they're virtually empty and really hungry is going to be a safe hay to feed to them, because otherwise they may take a huge meal right away of that high nitrate hay, and we've had situations where that's occurred and the animals start walking over to get a drink of water and they just fall over dead because of that sudden flush of nitrates going into their system.
If you're to take a nitrate test, you send it in, you're going to get it back, and what are you going to see for numbers and how do you use them? Well,
that's one place where some folks end up with some confusion, because the different labs that report on nitrates and will do these analyses, they typically report the nitrates in one of two different ways. And so the number that we get back and the interpretation that we give on it really needs to have associated with it our knowledge of how it's being reported. Those two ways that it's being reported are either as nitrate, just like we're always talking about it, or in a form that they call nitrate nitrogen. And the difference in the values of those numbers is more than fourfold. And so when we're looking at nitrates per se, typically here at the University of Nebraska, somewhere around 9,000 to 10,000 parts per million is the level where we think that we're at a potentially lethal level. And we see those kinds of numbers, we know that we need to be careful if we're going to be feeding that type of hay. If we're worried a little bit about giving it to pregnant animals at that time and want to minimize abortion, we tend to cut those numbers in half to around 5,000 as to the maximum level we'd want to give to the animals, especially if they haven't been accustomed to eating higher nitrate feeds. If we're talking about the other form, the nitrate nitrogen, the potentially lethal level is only around 2,100. A fourth of what that other one is. And so when we see a number, and particularly when someone gets something back that says it's 5,000, okay, is that as nitrate nitrogen, which would mean it's double the potentially lethal level, or is it as nitrate, which is half the potentially lethal level? So knowing what form we're getting it reported in, and then looking at the values that we have, we can do a good interpretation of how risky that hay is, and then what kind of management is needed to use that hay real safely.
Quick question, if you had taken a nitrogen or a nitrate test at the beginning of the season, maybe after harvest or something like that, do you expect those levels to change? Should I expect that I'm going to have to test again, or that those levels would change much?
The nitrates in hay stay pretty stable, so we don't see a weathering loss or any kind of other losses occur at the nitrates. So if you took something earlier, it's probably going to be pretty close to that yet at this time.
If you missed Bruce's conversation on what to look for when reading a forage analysis, that interview can be found on our website as part of the January 10th episode. Some farmers may be holding grain longer than usual this year, waiting for the right price to sell. But if you're keeping corn in the bin for a long time, it's important the grain is in good enough shape to maintain as much condition as possible. UNL Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems recently talked with us about monitoring the temperature and moisture levels of corn after a lengthy and often wet 2013 harvest.
There were a lot of problems that went on during harvest. We had a lot of corn, for instance, that was at very high moisture, and a lot of people might have forgotten, and I want to remind everybody to think back too about some of the problems we had during the season, because during the growing season we had a lot of damaged corn due to hail and high winds that could adversely affect us this winter and spring.
So what's the danger once it's in the bin? And bear in mind that some of the farmers might be keeping this grain for longer than usual, waiting for the right price.
Yeah, absolutely. And that could present a touchy situation for us, because a lot of that corn may have developed ear rot diseases, for instance, in the field because it got damaged and predisposed itself to some of those pathogens. Well, those fungi that cause the ear rot diseases need moisture and warm conditions. Well, unfortunately, inside a bin, we can't always adjust those conditions to make it more favorable for storage. And if we have low quality grain going in, even under the best storage conditions, at the very best we can only hope to keep it at that quality, but more than likely we'll have some of those grain molds develop and worsen.
Last year we talked with you at a certain time about mycotoxin problems that we had in some corn last year. What's the concern with that level this year?
Well, this year was a very different growing year in 2013. In 2012, we were more worried about aflatoxin and Aspergillus ear rot. Well, that disease and mycotoxin accumulate under very dry and hot conditions. Unfortunately, though, there's other mycotoxins. Since we're not worried about aflatoxin, there are other toxins produced by some of the more common fungi like Fusarium. And so there is potential to have fumonigens. And so that might change how people want to use the grain and feed it. And so they might consider having it tested for one of these grain molds and or the mycotoxins themselves.
What's the ideal percentage moisture that you'd like to see it at in the bin, and what happens once it gets above that for an extended period of time?
Oh, well, realistically, if you knew that you had a problem with ear rot diseases during the season, I'd recommend not even storing it because the risk of doing so is so high. Aside from that, though, if you were forced to try to store it to wait on prices or for whatever reason for use in feed, for instance, getting the moisture down to less than 15% is important to try to stop that mold growth and prevent it from getting worse. Now, on top of that, if you brought the corn out and harvested at 17 or 18%, which a lot of people had to do, that's going to make it even more difficult to keep it dry enough to keep it from growing.
So what recommendations do you give for making sure that you're at that right moisture and making sure it doesn't get too hot on you in the bin?
Well, you know, realistically, it takes a long time once we fill up our bins to cool that grain, which is also important, to cool the grain as quickly as possible and also to reduce the moisture as low as we can. Running the bins and running stirrers is one thing, but it might take longer than you might expect to get that entire bin cooled to the same temperature and low moisture. And so we have a lot of tools available online and publications that might help people to estimate that. But realistically, I hope people will continue to check the quality of that corn, and especially as we move into spring and temperatures begin to increase and fluctuate.
Once spring comes and that temperature outside begins to warm up, then what do you need to do to ensure optimum quality?
Well, this is especially important because as the temperature increases, it causes convection currents, that's air movement inside the bin. And what you have develop are cold and warm spots that change air movement. And then you have condensation develop. And moisture is your worst enemy inside a bin as far as grain molds and shelf life goes. And so I hope people will continue to pull samples and check the quality and check the moisture. And as temperatures begin to fluctuate in the spring, continue to run that bin fan for several days.
You mentioned some online resources or just normal resources. Where can people go for more information?
Absolutely. We have a lot of free publications from UNL Extension that are online, and they should always contact their local county extension office for more information.
Tamra says a 1% difference between 15% moisture and 14% moisture can double the shelf life of corn across all temperatures, and corn can last 4 times longer when moved from 18 down to 15%. Now with his weekly weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's take a look at what's happened during this last week. Really nothing in the way of significant moisture, a few trace events, but the real news was, of course, the high wind events that occurred as we had cold fronts move across the state on Tuesday and Thursday. The most extreme event was, of course, Thursday, where we had wind gusts across the state reported in excess of 55 miles per hour. With a lot of locations into the 60 to 65 mile an hour range, which made travel very difficult, especially for high profile vehicles. Now, it does look like the models are indicating that we will continue this above normal temperature trend for the vast majority of this forecast period, but things look to be changing in the models as we get into next weekend and the following week as another significant Arctic surge is being forecasted to invade the northern plains. And depending on how the systems coming into the western United States move into the central Rockies, we could be looking at the possibility of a significant weather maker developing as we approach the first part of February. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have going on. For today, what we do is have another system that's going to be pivoting around the periphery of an upper air low that sits over the Hudson Bay region. This will quickly move toward the northeast. Most of the moisture will remain east of Nebraska. We will see some cooler conditions across northeast and east central Nebraska, but as you get into western Nebraska, we should easily be up into the 40s with possibly some low 50s. Now, as we go into tomorrow, we'll notice that system is pivoted off and the ridge tries to build in. This does look to be, across the state, the warmest day of the 7-day period. easily could make it up into the upper 50s to low 60s across the northwest, and even in northeastern Nebraska, we should be well into the mid 40s, possibly approaching the 50-degree mark. Now, as we get into Monday, we'll see another piece of energy trying to dig down across the Great Lakes, and that'll bring a little bit cooler weather to the northeastern part of the state, probably looking at temperatures dropping somewhere between 5 and 7 degrees from Sunday. And in the southwest, we'll probably be looking more at the lower to mid 50-degree range. Now, as we go into Tuesday, most of the cold air remains to our east, and the ridge tries to build its way in, so we're going to be seeing a slight temperature increase, but only a couple degrees. And then as we get into the day on Wednesday, the vast majority of this cold air pushes toward our east. It does indicate that a cold front will be moving through the state, but it doesn't look like any moisture is going to be associated with that, primarily clouds. So we will see our temperatures cool back down to just slightly above normal, as we will see temperatures across the east primarily in the 40s, and we'll be pushing the mid to upper 40s across the west. On Thursday, we start to see the warm air once again build into our region, and we'll see a slight boost in temperatures, but you'll notice there's another piece of energy starting to move in on Thursday across the Great Lakes, and that will actually allow some colder air to start funneling into the state, and we'll see temperatures drop dramatically. In the northeast, we'll probably be looking at low 30s, and across the west, we'll be looking at the mid 40s. 8 to 14 day, or the temperature forecast as we go forward through the next 7 days does indicate warmest conditions across the southwest, coolest conditions across the northeast. And as we go to the 8 to 14 day forecast, considerable cold air from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, and we start to see an increase in precipitation across the northern plains.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews with Frayne Olson, Marion Kelmer, Bruce Anderson, and Tamra Jackson-Ziems are available individually on our website and through our mobile app as part of the January 17th episode. Next week, Jeff Peterson will be our grain marketing analyst, and Lauren Giesler will discuss the use of foliar fungicides in soybeans. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.